"What do you mean the account is overdrawn?" I asked, voice calm, eyes on my phone. Brandon's sister was ranting about how he'd promised to cover the rent, how she was now facing eviction. I kept my tone light, pretending to be just as shocked as she was. "He did what?" I murmured, playing dumb while scrolling through alerts I'd already seen hours ago. She had no idea I was the one who froze every account. Let her believe I was blindsided. Let her think Brandon had pulled one over on me. That's what he thought too, that he could vanish with our money and leave me with nothing but a cruel little note on the fridge. But he had no idea who he was married to. "My name is Isla. I'm 37. I'm a forensic accountant. And my husband? He just tried to scam the wrong woman. Ever outsmarted someone who thought they were using you?" Isla built her life with precision. A respected forensic accountant in Milwaukee, she spent over 15 years unraveling fraud schemes for major corporations. Her job demanded detail, logic, and trust in the evidence, but in her personal life, she ignored her own instincts. She met Brandon at a charity gala. He was confident, polished, and magnetic. He claimed to be an investment advisor, someone who helped high-net-worth clients diversify wisely. He drove a luxury sedan, wore a sleek designer watch, and made promises of shared dreams and ambition. Isla was drawn in, not by wealth, but by what seemed like stability, a man who could keep up with her finally. They married within a year. The first few years were beautiful. A home in the suburbs, long weekends in wine country, whispered conversations about starting a family. He made her laugh. He made her believe she could relax. And for a while, she did. But beneath the surface, small cracks formed. He was vague about his past. He bristled when she asked about his previous jobs. He'd change the subject when she brought up things like student loans or tax documents. When Isla offered to help organize their finances, Brandon would say, "You don't trust me?" and sulk for hours. Sometimes she'd catch him on the phone late at night, whispering. He always claimed it was a client. Sometimes he'd come home with expensive clothes or gadgets she hadn't budgeted for, claiming they were on sale or a gift from a grateful investor. Isla chalked it up to pride. She wanted to believe him. After all, people made mistakes, and he never asked her for money directly. But looking back, she could now see the pattern. Each mistake chipped away at her independence. Each guilt trip kept her quiet. The real shift came around year 5. Brandon suddenly showed a deep interest in their retirement savings. He had avoided finances for years, yet now he was asking specific questions. "What's our penalty if we move this early? How fast can we liquidate that?" He phrased it like curiosity, like planning for their future. But Isla felt a flicker of doubt. Then came the business trips that didn't match any legitimate conferences, the late nights, the locked drawer in his office, the sudden desire for separate holiday accounts so they could surprise each other. She played along, but she started watching closer. She noticed when he'd minimize browser windows as she entered a room. She marked how he always picked fights just before her deadlines, and she quietly began tracking small, suspicious transfers from their joint accounts. Still, she didn't want to believe it. She clung to the idea of love, of loyalty, of a man who once brought her flowers just because. But then, one morning over breakfast, Brandon casually asked her what would happen if someone drained a joint account during a divorce. "Just hypothetically," he said, smirking. That's when Isla knew. He wasn't just drifting away. He was preparing to disappear. And what he didn't realize was that his hypothetical question had just triggered a very real investigation, one that she was more than equipped to handle. Isla built her life with precision. A respected forensic accountant in Milwaukee, she spent over 15 years unraveling fraud schemes for major corporations. Her job demanded detail, logic, and trust in the evidence. But in her personal life, she ignored her own instincts. She met Brandon at a charity gala. He was confident, polished, and magnetic. He claimed to be an investment advisor, someone who helped high-net-worth clients diversify wisely. He drove a luxury sedan, wore a sleek designer watch, and made promises of shared dreams and ambition. Isla was drawn in, not by wealth, but by what seemed like stability. A man who could keep up with her. They married within a year. The first few years were beautiful. A home in the suburbs, long weekends in wine country, whispered conversations about starting a family. He made her laugh. He made her believe she could relax, and for a while she did. But beneath the surface, small cracks formed. He was vague about his past. He bristled when she asked about his previous jobs. He'd changed the subject when she brought up things like student loans or tax documents. When Isla offered to help organize their finances, Brandon would say, "You don't trust me?" and sulk for hours. Sometimes she'd catch him on the phone late at night, whispering. He always claimed it was a client. Sometimes he'd come home with expensive clothes or gadgets she hadn't budgeted for, claiming they were on sale or a gift from a grateful investor. Isla chalked it up to pride. She wanted to believe him. After all, people made mistakes, and he never asked her for money directly. But looking back, she could now see the pattern. Each mistake chipped away at her independence. Each guilt trip kept her quiet. The real shift came around year 5. Brandon suddenly showed a deep interest in their retirement savings. He'd avoided finances for years, yet now he was asking specific questions. What's our penalty if we move this early? How fast can we liquidate that? He phrased it like curiosity, like planning for their future. But Isla felt a flicker of doubt. Then came the business trips that didn't match any legitimate conferences, the late nights, the locked drawer in his office, the sudden desire for separate holiday accounts so they could surprise each other. She played along, but she started watching closer. She noticed when he'd minimize browser windows as she entered a room. She marked how he always picked fights just before her deadlines, and she quietly began tracking small, suspicious transfers from their joint accounts. Still, she didn't want to believe it. She clung to the idea of love, of loyalty, of a man who once brought her flowers, But then, one morning over breakfast, Brandon casually asked her what would happen if someone drained a joint account during a divorce. "Just hypothetically," he said, smirking. That's when Isla knew. He wasn't just drifting away, he was preparing to disappear. And what he didn't realize was that his hypothetical question had just triggered a very real investigation, one that she was more than equipped to handle. The cracks didn't just appear, they widened by the day. It started with something as simple as a change in holiday plans. Brandon insisted on using separate accounts to buy Christmas gifts that year. "It'll be more fun," he said. "We'll surprise each other." Isla raised an eyebrow but agreed, curious to see where this would lead. Soon after, credit card statements began showing strange activity: jewelry stores, high-scent boutiques, luxury travel sites. When Isla casually asked what he'd bought, Brandon grinned and said, "Just wait until Christmas." But no jewelry ever appeared. No surprise gift was unwrapped. Just a new hoodie and a bottle of wine. Nothing added up. Brandon's business trips increased. Quick turnarounds to Phoenix, Dallas, even New York, none of which lined up with any industry events she could verify. He never brought back receipts, just excuses. Last-minute meetings, client dinners, networking. Isla nodded along, all while silently logging the discrepancies. She noticed smaller things too. A new password on his laptop, a burner phone left in his gym bag, the way he'd ask if their joint accounts were insured in case of fraud. Each detail, while subtle, screamed preparation. It was the same one she'd flagged in countless corporate cases, but now it was her life. Rather than confront Brandon, Isla took a different path. She built a file, labeled every transaction, took screenshots, forwarded documentation to her private legal folder. Every purchase, every bank transfer, every lie, preserved. She didn't just suspect he was planning to leave. She knew. Then one night, the final confirmation arrived. It was close to midnight. Isla was working late at her firm when Susan, her longtime colleague, came rushing into her office. Her face was pale, her voice unsteady. "Isla, you need to see this." Susan handed her a report connected to the Thompson case, an ongoing investigation into a suspected Ponzi scheme involving multiple aliases. The document listed a familiar name under Person of Interest, Brandon. Isla froze. There it was, in black and white. Her husband's name attached to suspicious transactions in 3 states. Not just as a side character, but as the common thread. The same behaviors she'd seen at home: false accounts, gradual withdrawals, ghost transactions, were now showing up in federal case files. "I'm not just trying to rob you," Susan whispered. "He's been doing this to other women." Isla stared at the screen, her heart pounding but her face calm. In that moment, she understood. Brandon wasn't a failing husband. He was a serial predator, a con artist hiding behind a wedding band and a fake job title. She nodded slowly, swallowing the storm of emotions rising in her chest. "Okay," she said to Susan, voice steady. "Then it's time we treat this like every other case." Only this time, the victim wasn't a faithless corporation. It was her. And Brandon had no idea who he was actually dealing with. Isla didn't sleep that night. After Susan's discovery, she stayed at the office, combing through the forensic data with methodical precision. The deeper she dug, the worse it got. Brandon wasn't just siphoning their accounts. He was the common denominator in at least 3 separate fraud investigations across state lines. Each case followed a disturbingly familiar script. Brandon meets a successful woman, sweeps her off her feet, gains access to finances, then disappears just before the scheme unravels. In one report, he was Brandon Murphy. In another, Brandon Ellis. Different names, same playbook. By sunrise, Isla had assembled a detailed financial profile mapping his transactions. The patterns were textbook. Offshore accounts, disguised transfers, shell companies with paper-thin records. Brandon hadn't just been cheating on her emotionally, he was cheating the system. And worse, he'd done it before. Isla didn't cry. She printed every document, filed it in a folder labeled Robert's Case, and locked it in her drawer. That's when she made the call. Rachel Clark answered on the 3rd ring. "Isla, I was hoping you'd call," she said with a shaky breath. "He did it to you too, didn't he?" Over the next hour, they compared timelines, patterns, transactions. It was like reading the same book with different chapter titles. Same jewelry stores, same fake business trips, same lies. Except this time, Brandon hadn't picked just any woman. He'd picked a forensic accountant. Isla brought the evidence to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, requesting to speak directly with Agent Morrison. She laid everything out: personal financial records, links to previous victims, overlapping IP addresses, even recordings of Brandon discussing transfers. Morrison listened intently, barely blinking. "This is airtight," she finally said. "You've done half our job for us." "I intend to finish the other half," Isla replied. They coordinated a quiet investigation. Isla continued playing the role of unaware wife while feeding the FBI updates. They happily went on a date. They registered a pinball league. They flagged any move Brandon made would set off alarms. Then, like clockwork, he vanished. It was a Sunday morning. The bed was empty, his clothes gone. A single note taped to the fridge read, "Goodbye. Never love you anyway." Isla stared at it for a long moment. No anger, no heartbreak, just confirmation. He thought he'd outplayed her. She smiled, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Brandon didn't realize the trap he'd walked into was of his own making. Every lie, every stolen scent, every name change, it was all documented, and now in federal hands. He was used to running, but this time he wasn't running from just another scorned woman. He was running from someone who'd made a career out of hunting men like him. And Isla had no intention of letting him vanish without consequence. He wasn't her husband. He was her case. Brandon made his move Monday morning. Isla knew it before her phone even buzzed. A series of alerts lit up her screen: declined withdrawal attempts, blocked credit card charges, flagged logins from an unfamiliar IP address. He was trying to access their emergency fund, just like she predicted. But every account was already frozen, every card deactivated, every transfer set to notify both her and the FBI. She sat at her desk sipping coffee as the alerts rolled in like waves. Each one was proof that the trap was working. By noon, a message arrived. "I messed up. Can we talk?" Just once. She stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back. "Coffee? Tomorrow. Usual place. 9 a.m. She met with Agent Morrison that night, handing over her final notes, audio setups, and the evidence folder. Morrison nodded. "We'll be nearby. Stay calm." The next morning, Isla dressed in a navy blazer and heels, crisp and calm. She walked into the cafe like she hadn't just helped orchestrate a federal sting. Brandon was already seated in the back corner, wearing his signature grin, the same one that used to charm her, now nothing more than a smirk stretched over arrogance. "Isla," he said softly, standing to pull out her chair. "Thank you for meeting me." She sat down without a word, crossing her arms. "I panicked," he started. "Bad investments, things got out of hand. But I want to make things right." She let him talk. He painted himself as a victim of the system, a misunderstood dreamer. Every word was laced with manipulation, each pause designed to draw sympathy. Isla stayed quiet, nodding occasionally, letting him believe he had a chance. "You still love me, right?" he asked, leaning forward. "I know you do. We can fix this." She reached into her bag and slid a thick folder across the table. Brandon's smile wavered. "What's this?" she said calmly. "Every account you tried to drain, every name you've used, every woman you've lied to. You're not just a fraud, Brandon. You're a predator." He opened the folder, flipping through the neatly organized files: bank statements, offshore account records, screenshots of fake identities, even a signed affidavit from Rachel Clark. "Where did you get all this?" She smiled faintly. "You married a forensic accountant. You really didn't think I was watching." His hands trembled slightly as he shut the folder. "Isla, we can work something out." But she was already standing. Two plainclothes agents stepped up from a nearby table and showed their badges. "Brandon Roberts, you're under arrest for financial fraud, identity theft, and interstate conspiracy." His face drained of color. "Wait, you can't. Isla, please." She turned, her voice even and clear. "You picked the wrong woman to As they cuffed him, patrons in the cafe began to notice. Phones were lifted. Whispers swirled. Brandon, the polished charmer, now looked like a trapped animal, caught mid-lie. Isla didn't stay to watch the full spectacle. She walked out into the sunlit street, her heels clicking confidently on the pavement. Behind her, the door chimed as the agents led Brandon away in handcuffs. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. Under the quiet hume of her office's overhead lights, Isla spread out files across the desk. Across from her sat Rachel, her expression sharp, alert, matching Isla's intensity. To their right, Susan, the analyst who had first spotted Brandon's name buried in a fraud case file. What began as Isla's personal nightmare had now turned into a full-scale operation, with women from different cities and backgrounds joining forces to expose a man who thought he was untouchable. Over the next week, piece by piece, the truth emerged. Brandon Thompson didn't exist. Neither did Brandon Murphy. His real name was Brandon Roberts, and he wasn't just a manipulative husband. He was a professional con artist, wanted for fraud charges in Canada going back to 2015. More victims came forward. Some had known him as a charming investment advisor, others as a nonprofit consultant. All told the same story: love bombing, rushed relationships, financial secrecy, then theft. Rachel had been his third wife. Isla was number 6. Each woman brought new documentation, helping map out his trail across 5 states and 3 countries. Even the woman claiming to be his sister? A lie. Her real name was Kelly Daniels, and she'd played the desperate sibling in at least 4 of his known scams, calling in fake emergencies to extract money, gain trust, and cover Brandon's disappearances. Together, they had orchestrated a long con against a dozen women. Until now. But the worst part wasn't behind them. It was what Brandon had planned next. Susan looked up from her screen one evening and said, "Isla, you need to see this." She turned her monitor. There on the screen were emails from Brandon's encrypted server, recently accessed before his arrest. Drafts, client lists, strategy notes. All tied to a shell company he was preparing to launch using Isla's credentials. Her name, her license number, her firm's address. The plan? Use her reputation as a forensic accountant to lure high-net wealth clients into investing in a fake wealth management fund, a Ponzi scheme on a scale far beyond what he'd pulled before. Isla's chest tightened. "He wasn't just trying to rob me," she said. "He was going to become me." Rachel clenched her jaw. "He wanted to leave you with the legal fallout." Isla nodded. "But he won't." Because she had one more piece of the puzzle. Caroline Mitchell. On paper, she was just another impressive woman Brandon had been wooing. Hedge fund manager, connections in finance, well known in elite investment circles. But what Brandon didn't know was that Caroline was one of Isla's oldest friends, and she had been helping them track his every move for months. From country club dinners to late-night calls, Caroline recorded everything. Every promise he made, every fake name he used, every pitch he rehearsed for his next scam. But all the while he'd been laying out a detailed confession. On tape. With the case closed and Brandon locked away, Isla channeled her expertise into something far greater. The FBI invited her to help design a training program focused on detecting financial fraud and romantic scams. It became a groundbreaking initiative, with Isla leading seminars across the country. She taught investigators how to recognize subtle red flags and decode the manipulation tactics used by con artists. Her lectures weren't just informative, they were lived experience turned into wisdom. Rachel joined her as a consultant, bringing the perspective of someone who'd lost nearly everything but refused to be broken. Together, they created a survivor-led platform for education, support, and financial recovery. Their work was personal, and every workshop felt like reclaiming a little more of what Brandon had tried to steal. Meanwhile, the digital forensics team continued tracing Brandon's hidden accounts. Offshore funds began surfacing, slowly but steadily. Victims started receiving restitution, piece by piece. For some, it was enough to restart a business. For others, it was simply validation, proof that justice was more than just a word on a court docket. Isla moved into a new apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The space was bright, minimalist, and entirely hers. No shadows, no secrets, just open air, clean lines, and peace. She hung framed photos of her parents, her friends, and one from the press conference, the day she stood shoulder to shoulder with women who'd once been strangers but had become sisters in strength. She resumed her consulting work with renewed energy, now specializing in unraveling white-collar crimes. Every time she cracked open a new case file, she remembered what it felt like to be blindsided. She used that memory, not as a wound, but as fuel. Her pain had taught her how to protect others. And now, she was doing exactly that. In one of her workshops, a young agent asked, "What do you do when someone like Brandon thinks they're smarter than you?" Isla smiled and replied, "You let them believe it, just long enough for them to walk into your trap." Her story had started with betrayal, but it no longer belonged to Brandon. It belonged to Isla now. And every day, with every case she helped solve, she rewrote what it meant to be a woman, betrayed. Not broken, but empowered. Her past didn't define her future. She did. The room was silent as Isla stood at the podium, the seal of the FBI projected behind her. Analysts, agents, and investigators watched intently as she clicked the final slide of her presentation. The Thompson case. How one woman exposed a multi-state fraud ring. The irony of the name didn't escape her. Thompson wasn't her name anymore, and the man it once belonged to, he was just a footnote in her story now. She glanced at the crowd, then paused. "When Brandon left," she said, "he thought he was taking everything from me. My money, my peace, my future. But in trying to destroy me, he gave me something far more powerful. Clarity, strength, and purpose." There was a beat of silence, then applause. But Isla wasn't looking for validation. She'd already found what mattered. That night, she stood on her balcony overlooking Lake Michigan, the wind soft against her face, a glass of wine in hand. The city lights sparkled like a promise she'd made to herself and kept. She thought of the note he'd left on the fridge. "Never loved you anyway." She smiled. Because she'd learned that love, real love, starts from within, and the woman she'd become, she was done living for anyone else's version of truth. She raised her glass to the waves and whispered, "Here's to surviving. Here's to thriving." And for the first time in a long time, Isla Morgan felt completely, powerfully free.